they've been struggling on the line of scrimmage, and I think that's been their biggest problem. Once they started getting some creases on the offensive line, you started seeing McCaffrey and Bryce Love racking up the yards again. But they still had an awful game against Colorado, in which I believe the final score was 10-5, and their defense looked amazing. Their offense was just ridiculously bad. But the defense has been strong all season, but there's only so much they can do, especially strapped with injuries, and especially if your offense can't get a first down sometimes. So they're a little bit like a better version of Boston College from last year, if you'll recall. But the offensive line, they've been making some tweaks, got some new guys in, and they've come along really well. And so that's when you saw this sort of uptick. Now, granted, that was against the likes of Oregon and Cal and Rice, not exactly world beaters when it comes to run defense, but they've really picked it up on the line, and I'm actually pretty excited to see what Bryce Love can do with an offensive line that has had 12 to 15 practices. And when he's the feature back now, he's going to get 25 plus carries on Friday, and I'm excited to see what he can do with it.
Stanford loves to run the football, even if Christian McCaffrey's not around. And you talked about Love's contribution and that he's going to be center stage in the rushing attack. Now, if Stanford really wanted to kind of digress from what they typically do, but still run the ball, they could throw on the videotape from last year's bowl game in the Russell Athletic Bowl and see where Baylor ran for like 550 yards against North Carolina. So they may be able to do it with much different sets and different personnel, but this North Carolina defense, it's been much improved from where they were a couple of years ago when Gene Chizik took them over. So he's done a remarkable job, but it's still a pretty vulnerable defense, and Stanford, I believe, might be able to push them around all day.
Yeah, if I recall, wasn't that Baylor Bowl game when they had a wide receiver starting a quarterback? So you knew
they were down to their fourth-string quarterback. They were missing their best running back, and they still had two guys run for 200 yards, and they ran for like 550, a bowl record. They just could not be stopped. And they had a wide receiver running. You know that they're not going to throw, and they still couldn't stop him. It's amazing.
Everybody in the building knows exactly what you're going to do, and you still can't stop it. Oh, poor North Carolina. I think they're better, the Tar Heels, as a defense. They've definitely improved at the linebacker spot. They're still very young, but they've got a lot better young talent coming in. But having said that, this team did almost win their division in the ACC. Not for the Hurricane game against Virginia Tech, the Tar Heels would have been right there. Probably still would have lost to Clemson, but UNC is not to be taken lightly, even with some of their struggles on offense, and they're going to have a hard time, I think, stopping Bryce Love. I think they're going to have to figure out an answer for Love. If not, then just keep handing him the ball and then do whatever you need to do. Now, I will say this little deja vu all over again, if you will. Stanford's quarterback, Keller Christ, is running a lot more than he is passing. So you're still going to have a running quarterback, not a lot of passes, and a heavy emphasis on the run. If you're new UNC's defense, you've got to expect a lot of run. If you can't win in the box on defense, Stanford's just going to take it to you.
So, Nick, bowl season's about motivation, and we try to project who wants to be there and who doesn't, because there are a lot of teams that have high expectations. They're the blue bloods, and maybe they lose 2 or 3 games and it knocks them down a couple tiers, and they're not playing for a championship. Then you have other teams that come out of nowhere and they're fired up and they really rallied at the end of the year, made something of their season, and they come in. I think that's a little bit overplayed. I think it's kind of difficult in this game because you've got a Stanford team that's maybe not at the elite of college football in terms of a program, despite the strides that Jim Harbaugh and now David Shaw have made. They're close. They're in that top 10 to 12 programs in the country. North Carolina maybe a tier back. They're in that top 25 range. Larry Fedora's done a nice job. So I think both teams are probably pretty motivated to be there. But the other thing that makes bowl season interesting is matching up different teams from different conferences that are like seeded. So it should be a barometer, a slice of a barometer of how good the conferences are. And then the other thing is just the matchup of personnel and styles. And we have a classic contrasting style matchup here because Stanford, as we're alluding to, wants to slug it out on offense, wants to rule the line of scrimmage, wants to flex the muscles and show that they are more of a man-to-man than your other team. And North Carolina, it's probably a bit too much of an over-perception, but I think there's some truth to it. They love the wide receivers. They love the quarterback. They've got one of the best in Mitch Trubisky. He's probably going to be the highest drafted quarterback coming out. I've heard that. Deshaun Watson and others would probably shudder to think that, and it's tough to envision that, but that's what I've heard. Mitch Trubisky's on top of a lot of boards, and they've got tons of wide receivers and playmakers at North Carolina. But the contrasting styles is going to be interesting. In which does the team that gets their playmakers out in space, do they gain the advantage, and does it turn into that kind of game, or does the Stanford muscle win out?
I really like this matchup because it's Stanford's defensive strength against UNC's offensive strength, and the wide receivers and the DBs are going to be duking it out. A lot of positioning. You were right about Mitch Trubisky. Depending on how much stock or faith you put in Pro Football Focus, he is right up there. He was one of the best in all of college. I think he has the highest PFF grade in all the quarterbacks, either in the draft or considering the draft. So, your faith in Mitch Trubisky, I think, pretty much revolves around how much you buy into Pro Football Focus and their grades. I will say, though, it's going to be exciting to watch a more healthy Stanford secondary take on a lot of these really talented wide receivers who have done some amazing things this year. This offense is, for UNC, really, really clicks and goes along pretty well. They've had some close calls, and I do like that we're going to have an opportunity to see, maybe just how good the ACC is compared to the Pac-12. I know it's not a great representative, but these are two teams that, maybe fell below expectations. I'm not sure about what North Carolina's expectations were coming into the season. I know Stanford absolutely has. But I think that also speaks to where Stanford's at as a program, where anything below the Rose Bowl is a disappointment. And so, it's going to be interesting. I don't think there's a problem with motivation, at least not on Stanford's end. You've got a lot of guys that have had struggling years, a lot of talent, but haven't quite put it all together yet. And so they're really looking to go out there on a national stage without Christian McCaffrey and go, hey, we're pretty good too. This isn't just, we're not just here to take a little bit of the load off of Christian McCaffrey the once out of every 5 plays he takes off. We're pretty good too. So I'm really excited to see Bryce Love, Chris, and the reloaded offensive line for Stanford really put it together.
Nick, in terms of expectations not met, I think these two programs are very similar here in 2016. Carolina went to the ACC championship game and won its division last year. And despite losing quarterback Marquise Williams, Carolina insiders knew that the guy coming behind him was actually better, less experienced, but a better prototypical quarterback, and it's turned out that way. Mitch Trubisky, outside of one horrible effort against Virginia Tech, has been outstanding. And so they were expecting to win the division. Now, they weren't like lock and barrel favorites, odds-on favorites, but they were the favorite over Miami and Pitt and some other teams in a very balanced division. And they almost won it, but they lost the head-to-head to Virginia Tech, so it didn't happen. For Stanford, as you know, even better than I do, they expected to win the division, but to a certain extent, if you were looking at the glass half full and knew what the program had built up to and what the expectations are now kind of going forward each and every year, but if you were really looking at this particular team and Washington's emergence, over the last couple of years and where that was headed, most of us thought, okay, this is probably not a year Stanford's going to get it done. Washington's probably going to be really good if all the pieces come into play like we expect them to. And that's kind of how it played out.